Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast with our rotating hosts and rotating guests. Ashley, this is actually my first time helping with an interview. I've been slacking. You've really been leading this charge.
Well, welcome back into the fold, Jason.
Yeah, black sheep for a while, prodigal son. It's okay. Well, without further ado, I want to welcome our guest, Tao Orion. I'm just going to read your Twitter profile, and then I'm going to let you kind of expand on that. Does that work? Oh, okay, so Tao Orion is designing climate adaptive systems for a regenerative future. Author is Beyond the War on Invasive Species, or author of the Beyond the War on Invasive Species, which we'll talk about. You have a master's degree in climate change, ag and food security, and you have a farm, Veriditas Farm. So now I'll hand it to you, and you live on Kalapuya land. So now I'll let you expand on all of that.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh wait, hold on. We're not recording, are we? We are recording? Okay. Yeah, we are recording. Okay, we'll cut that out. Go ahead, Tao.
Great. Awesome. Yeah, it's good to be here with you all. I am calling in from Western Oregon, just south of Eugene, outside of a small town called Cottage Grove, where I've lived for about 15 years. And I have a small farm here, and I've also been involved for many years with a 40-acre nonprofit sustainable living education and demonstration center that's just right up the road from where I live. And yeah, have been involved in land care, land stewardship endeavors in this area and all over the Pacific Northwest for the most part for many years. And I love talking about land management and water and food and all of those different intersecting things. So I'm happy to be here and chat about those related subjects.
Wonderful. I'll jump in. I'm wondering if you could outline for those who haven't read it, your book Beyond the War on Invasive Species. Like, what are the main takeaway points to just kind of get us started, and then we can get into some of the nitty gritty of your perspective?
Sure. Well, my background is in agroecology and sustainable food systems. And so I've been practicing organic farming and, growing food for many years. And it was about almost 10 years ago now that I got a job doing ecological restoration, kind of thinking that I'd kind of brush up on my botany and native plant skills. So I got a job as a botanist with my local county, the Public Works Department, doing restoration. And I was really surprised right off the bat that there was such a widespread use of herbicide to restore ecosystems. And, kind of in air quotes, restore. So I was pretty much on the first day of my job there, I said, to my supervisor, I'm not going to be able to use herbicide. I'm just not going to do it. I come from kind of a different perspective about how to manage, weeds. And as an organic farmer, it's just not something that's in my wheelhouse. And I'd like to come up with some other solutions to address the issues that we're dealing with on this particular site. And so I was like, I can quit now if this isn't a good fit, or let's, come up with something a little bit more creative. So it kind of went up the chain of command at the county, and they decided that they would try on this 64-acre site to stop using herbicide and implement some other things, which included the use of fire and also the use of teens. We brought in a youth work crew to learn more about being out in the world, and they are actually paid, and they are still, the program is still ongoing, where they come out every week and they get school credit and they get paid to be out stewarding this site. And so that's been kind of a cool thing that's come out of it. But kind of for me, my underlying perspective, because I started delving into the literature of invasion ecology when I was there, and I was like, what is going on with this worldview that's driving so many people to just, broadcast spray Roundup in wetlands, like the one I was working in. And I started to kind of tease it apart and see that in my view, it's the whole kind of idea that invasive species are threatening ecosystems is really based on a very basic and linear understanding of natural systems that, if there's something that we don't like that's happening, we can just apply a chemical and take care of it. It's very similar to the conventional agricultural practices where if you have a pest, you spray it and then it's gone. And, as though that was the end of the story, and as though that works over the long term, which, as many of us know, it doesn't, because it's not really working with fundamental ecological principles. So I kind of try to address some of the underlying factors that are going on in ecosystems that feature invasive species and think about it from what I like to call forensic ecology perspective, like what has happened here in the past that's led to the proliferation of invasive species, and how can we kind of like apply that understanding to a management plan for the future, and like what do we want to see here instead. And we're not going back, because that's like this other kind of weird part about restoration is like there's this idea that you can go back to something that was like 1750 was like, the date. It was like the really good day in North America that, it's the reference ecosystem that most ecologists are working from, but it's like, really, like none of us were here then, and a lot has changed. Like, major damming of rivers and major deforestation and major conversion of ecosystems into agriculture. We're not looking at the same ecosystem now. So those are some of the kinds of things that I'd like to kind of, get into.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I think I just want to highlight that it's just so like pure Doomer optimism, because basically there is a doom element. You have to recognize that we're not in the past, we're not working from the same first principles, we don't have the same, I don't know, ideal ecology, or at least what one thinks of as an ideal ecology as a starting point. We're in a place, it's different. There's huge amounts of industrial land use. And so how do we move forward, considering that fact and just acknowledging the reality of it, I think is huge. Jason, do you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, this sounds kind of like it's like a paradigm shift from restoration to regeneration, right? My understanding, and actually I think we interacted on this on Twitter, regeneration is kind of like working from where you're at and trying to find, understanding that we're not going back, we're in a dynamic ecosystem that only moves forward. And so, how do we regenerate, human livelihood strategies with ecosystem health and robustness? And that could include, for example, what we would consider invasive species. And so it's finding a new way to interact with the ecology that is now present. Would you characterize it like that? And do you want to talk more about kind of like this distinction between restoration and regeneration?
Sure, I think that's a really good point, and that's definitely the angle that I come from, because I feel like people have a really important role to play, and we always have played in ecosystems. And kind of one of the things that I challenge about conventional restoration ecology is that there's this idea that nature just exists on its own, and we should block it off and put it aside and save it from people. And that's kind of this like Western notion that many indigenous people didn't interact with land in that way. and don't still. And, there's like this thread of understanding the role that people can play as beneficial stewards of ecosystems, and participants in regeneration. And I think that that's something that we've kind of like lost the thread in our current, dominant paradigm. And so bringing that forward and kind of helping people to understand how they can interact in ways that can bring more life and more biodiversity and more, beneficial outcomes, not only for us, but for other species, I think is really important right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jason, do you have a follow-up question? Because I have a comment.
I don't have a follow-up question. No. Go ahead.
Okay. So, all right. So I have a passage from your book I want to read at this point, and this is the only thing I'm going to actually read from your book, but it was so good. I underlined the whole thing and felt like I have to read it out loud. So I'll skip a little bit, but basically, this is not your writing. This is somebody Kat Anderson, an ethnoecologist who works for the National Resource Conservation Service, says, contemporary Indians often use the word wilderness as a negative label for land that has not been taken care of by humans for a long time. For example, when a dense understory shrubbery or thickets of young trees block visibility and movement. California Indians have a sentiment that a hands-off approach to nature has promoted feral landscapes that are inhospitable to life. Quote, the white man sure ruined this country, said James Rust, a Southern Sierra Miwok elder. It's turned back into wilderness. California Indians believe that when humans are gone from an area long enough, they lose the practical knowledge about correct interactions, and the plants and animals retreat spiritually from the earth or hide from humans. When intimate interaction ceases, the continuity of knowledge passed down through the generations is broken and land becomes, quote, wilderness. Okay. So this is huge because there's a whole subset of environmentalists who think like humans are horrible. They need to like go into cities and then, nature needs to rewild. But at the same time, there's a subset of environmentalists who say we need to like understand indigenous perspectives. So these two like subsets are I would say fundamentally at odds, because it seems to me it's actually the process of being in land, in ecosystems, that actually teaches us how to be in them. It's like an iterative process of like being in is the teaching, is the process of learning. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, and don't be shy about getting into the nitty-gritty of the politics of environmentalism if you
Sure.
want.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point is it's such a hot topic right now. It's being discussed at the conference of parties, the climate change conference right now, in terms of what does stopping deforestation mean? Does that mean you're going to be conserving land and kicking people off of it who have traditionally inhabited and used the forest and actually increased its biodiversity over the course of the last several thousand years? Because that's the mode that many people have existed in a land-based context. That's our collective history as people, is living with land and understanding that the things that we do contribute to our livelihood and our ability to survive, and wanting to maintain and enhance those relationships and things that provide for our needs is kind of something that is present in all of us. And I think that we've gotten away from that more recently, at least some people. And but I think finding ways that we can kind of meaningfully reinsert ourselves into land management and questioning what's become kind of the dominant paradigm of highly extractive agriculture, forestry, for the benefit of the quote economy, and seeing the ecological results of that, and also the social results. Like, we're not, we don't have relationships with land anymore. And I think so much about like people not being able to, and kids being sent to buildings away from land and not really being able to have meaningful interactions with their watershed or the animals where they live, and all of these ways that disconnections happen is so unfortunate, and just continues to ripple through our social, economic, ecological systems. So yeah, I think that there's some interesting shifts happening even since that the book came out in 2015, and in California, even in the last legislative session, there's a huge push to bring indigenous fire-based management back into California's ecosystems, because there's a recognition now that level of management, which was very intentional for thousands of years, is what kept these mega fires from happening. I mean, climate change is one kind of thread that's coming through, but another thread is significant shifts in land management and ecosystem characteristics that are leading to the types of fires that we've been seeing. So if we're able to, be active managers again in those spaces, then we can kind of mitigate some of those really bad effects that we're starting to see.
I'm curious if you want to talk about your own journey towards kind of feeling of a place and connecting with the land. I imagine that you're very busy these days because your family has your own farm, which I'd love to hear about, and also you work as a consultant, or you help others manage their land in more regenerative ways. I'm curious how all of that connects for you and how you got to doing what you're doing now. Because it seems like a very wonderful lifestyle, but it also seems very busy and exhausting as well, I'm sure. So if you want to talk about that, that would be cool.
Sure, yeah. It's very full and very dynamic. There's always something new going on every day, which is fun and unpredictable, but we're just rolling with it for the most part. My husband and I moved down to this area to work at the nonprofit that I mentioned many years ago, and he was working in the forestry department there, and I was working as the organic gardening teacher. And so we kind of got our start in this area doing that, and also started teaching permaculture design courses there. And so, just got a lot of experience both managing the land and also applying some of these concepts, and working with people and in an education context, and have then moved on to this land, which is somewhat of a it's really close, and so we still have a close relationship with that nonprofit. So we've been involved in various programs over the years, but have started doing more consulting and just engagement with other sites and people in the area. And one of the things that we do now, we work mostly with kind of larger scale properties, doing like forestry planning and agroforestry planning, water system like ponds, swales, water harvesting, fire mitigation, and sustainable agriculture also, to some extent. My background is more in agriculture, so as our kids have gotten older, I've been able to do more consulting, and kind of we're always kind of here and there, and we have our farm. We haven't designed it to be an income producing farm. We have we've grown seed crops for some organic seed companies that friends own in the area. We sell elderberries. That's one of our cash crops. We've sold lamb and pork, kind of here and there, but we're not doing it with the intention of having that be our primary income stream. We do you know, most of our paid work is the consulting and teaching work. So that's kind of nice because, you know, we have 6.5 acres, it's small scale. It would be hard in our current economy to make a living off of this particular piece of land. But we are able to kind of iterate it out and, you know, have a bunch of fun things and, you know, family scale food production, which, you know, to me is, that's how I like to spend my time. I've done market farming for many years in my earlier adulthood. And, you know, I sincerely appreciate people who do that and, you know, support them financially as well with the things that I can't grow here or I don't grow. So, but that's just, it's not something that we're focused on right now. Although we could, you know, we're talking about what other cash crops we might like to put in the future. Probably we're thinking about kiwis, persimmons. You know, we live in an area that's a pretty, there's a lot of really good agricultural land. So there's a lot of like big, super productive organic farms that do like all the veggies and all the staples. And so it's harder to kind of break into that market as a small scale farmer. And so we're kind of thinking about those kind of niche crops that could do well on this land within the soil type and things like that. That could kind of complement what some of the bigger scale farmers are already offering. So.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like a diversified livelihood strategy that is often held up by, I don't know, people like Wendell Berry and kind of this notion that, you know, that farmers in the past had just one cash crop and went to the supermarket doesn't make any sense. Like some family members might have worked in town, the nearby town, like there was perhaps other income streams, you know, some stuff was sold, but a lot of stuff was for subsistence. You know, that to me actually seems like, you know, the direction that we ought to go. You know, I don't think we should all become market farmers and and that's it. It's like, you know, a diversified livelihood, diversified economies seems to be more dynamic or more diversified. I'm curious if you see things that way.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of like, you know, there's the permaculture principle of, you know, don't put all of your eggs in one basket, or, you know, you should always support, you know, your need with multiple things from the ecosystem that you create. Multiple elements in your system should support your function that you're identifying. So that's one way that we do it. Like if, you know, there's a downturn and, you know, a slower time with our consulting, which definitely hasn't been the case lately, but, you know, we do have, like, we grow a lot of our own food, so we do have, like, you know, less of a need to make as much money to buy things. So, you know, I think ratcheting that consumption level down and like expectations around, you know, what a good life entails and, you know, the things that you need, especially in, you know, the kind of modern American context where it's, you know, there's big houses and there's, you know, lots of energy intensive appliances and all these different things that are just have become normalized. And it's like, oh, I mean, we definitely have some of those, but we've definitely also on purpose scaled back on a lot of the buying of things, you know, and I've just found like a middle ground that works and is comfortable, you know. And I think that's part of this conversation too, is especially for folks in North America that are, you know, in a position to decide about the level of consumption that they have, to kind of like ratchet that down and stop using so many resources and so much energy, is something that we really need to grapple with, and how we're going to manage energy. Not, I don't like to use the word decline exactly, but kind of like, can we design our livelihood systems around using less, with the idea that, you know, it's not going to be as freely available, and we shouldn't expect that we can just kind of keep consuming at this level forever.
Yeah, and I think one thing I really like is thinking about maybe framing it in terms of what we gain, and that out of these different, more holistic, more regenerative systems. In your book, you talk about how you'd like to see a more restoration economy, you know, I think also just a regenerative economy. You say restoration should be designed into every aspect of our lives. And so I'm wondering if you could talk through a little bit, you know, for your normal person who doesn't really have like, you know, even have any land that to speak of to really like interact with, or might want to begin interacting with landscapes and having a, you know, a choice as to how things work. I'd like to just read a couple of examples you have in your book. We need to build gray water systems, rainwater cisterns, composting toilets. We need to learn to plant, propagate, and eat perennial foods. Decrease the consumption of foods produced far away with water from even further away. We need to depave, cut curbs, and slow spread and sink every drop of precious water into the land that fit our lifestyles within the ecological potential of the region. So I'm just like wondering, I know that I think about this, the type of education you're involved with. I think about all the different ways in which you can approach a more regenerative or, you know, restoration economy that are like wonderful and have function stacking and are something like people would want and are looking for. I mean, I think a lot of people are pretty fed up with the consumerism and the treadmill and all of that. So I'm wondering if you can, you know, what are first steps? What are examples? What are ways for normal people to start approaching this?
Well, you know, one thing I have found interesting, and maybe this is the kind of tangential way to answer the question. I've been helping with the permaculture design course at Oregon State University for many years, the online course, and we always have an assignment where people have to map their home watersheds. And of all of the assignments for years, like, you know, we do that 3 times a year. This is the hardest thing for people to do. And so I think that in a way, like, that is a really good place to start, is to kind of think about where you've landed, you know, whether that's your, you know, the place that you were born, or the, you know, for all the ways that we move around and wherever you find yourself now. Think about your watershed, like where are you? Like, locate yourself and think about, you know, when a drop of water falls on your apartment building or your, you know, house, or wherever it is, trace that drop and think about what it encounters on its way to, you know, the ocean or wherever it's going to end up. I think that's a really interesting thing that everybody can do, and maybe start to think about land in a different way, and water, and all of these different things. Because I can't tell you how many people would write to me after their assignment and be like, I live in LA, I don't have a watershed. And, you know, there is no watershed here. And it's like, it may appear that way, but actually, you know, and those spaces are like the most important places in a way to kind of get that knowledge and to like walk the path of it and see where it ends up. And what kind of feelings does that bring up in you in terms of like how you think about what you can do? Does that make you feel like you want to be more active and you go down to the water department and be like, what the heck is going on here? You know, maybe that'll spur some interest in in engaging in a different way. So that might be something to start with. Just those little things, you know, to kind of like place you can be kind of helpful.
Yeah, I think totally. Jason, did you have a follow-up?
Not a follow-up. I was gonna switch gears a little bit, but if we want to
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, you know, how this kind of discussion fits into the context of climate change. I recall that you had a post a while back talking about that you were worried that we wouldn't be able to adapt fast enough to changing climate or something along those lines. And I'm wondering, so, you know, in climate change discussions, there's also often this distinction between mitigation and adaptation, and that we need both. But I'm wondering, you know, how you think, well, one, I mean, adapting to climate change is one thing, but you know, what is kind of, do you have a kind of a theory of the future of how you, in your realist days, you know, how you think it's going to play out? Are we going to, you know, is it going to be like a forcing function that is going to compel us to live more landed lives? Is there some benefit to getting ahead of the curve? How do you think about this in the context of climate change and again, on your realist days, like, you know, where are we going to be in 30 years?
Wow. Oh boy. Well, yeah, I would say, you know, I've been working to kind of build in adaptation measures into our livelihood system for years, like rainwater catchment and gray water. And, you know, here in Oregon, it rains a lot in the winter, but it doesn't rain in the summer in the growing season. So irrigation is, you know, and water delivery is important for many of the kind of European like agricultural crops that aren't native to this area. So when we had the heat dome event, which it was like 113 degrees here for like 3 or 4 days, and it didn't go below 80 at night. It was like, and that is highly unusual for I mean, it's never been that hot here at that time of year. And, you know, all over still, like many of the conifer trees are dropping needles. It was a major stress event that I think, and we knew it was coming like a week in advance. And so we were running around and watering everything and, you know, just trying to, you know, we had just shored our sheep. So it was like, okay, there's that. But, you know, it made me wonder, like, okay, you know, like we have Icelandic sheep. Are they get these huge, you know, pelts. They're super woolly. Are they going to be the best sheep here? Like, you know, are we going to have to shear them twice? Like, what are the, you know, the real implications of like keeping animals like that, you know, that came from Iceland in a very, if this is not going to be a similar type of climate. And also just, you know, wondering about the viability of some of the species that seem like sure bets to plant, like food producing species. You know, if they aren't well suited to those types of pulses of, you know, disturbance in the, you know, what has been the norm, that's concerning. And as somebody that's, you know, I've spent a lot of time like growing different things and really seeing the level of stress that happened this year, excuse me, was alarming. And I know many farmer friends said the same thing, and we were like, oh, well, I'm glad that only lasted 3 days. Because there's nothing you can do. You know, you can't make it go away. You can't turn on the big fan and just cool everything down. Yeah, you know, I've been kind of like sitting with that, and my husband and I have been talking about, he's, you know, he's more of a agroforestry person. And so he's been trying to convince me to plant like kind of shade, like mild shade casting canopy trees in our annual garden. And I've been like, no. But after the summer, I'm like, okay, well, maybe we should. Like, so we're thinking about some like nitrogen fixers, like albizia, which, you know, we can train to grow up and kind of spread in a kind of dappled shade canopy. And we'll actually put that in our main annual producing area as both fertility, but also shade. Because we don't want to do plastic shade cloth, but it, you know, in Southern Oregon, that's like what most vegetable farmers have now. After the past, like over the past, you know, 10 to 15 years, everybody's growing lettuce under plastic shade cloth, black, you know, shade cloth, which I think is unfortunate, you know. So thinking about those like biological adaptation strategies, and you know, I think being realistic about the fact that, you know, these pulses of things that we're seeing and starting to experience aren't gonna go away, and they'll probably intensify a little bit or a lot, but hopefully not much more. And planning around that and kind of seeing what those trend lines look like, and, you know, making plans based on those now will be helpful.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering, like, I guess I don't, maybe we can just explicitly say some of the philosophy behind your book is more or less to just use biological resources as they're useful, and the idea that, you know, there are good plants or bad plants, weeds being bad plants, people call them weeds, and instead taking, I don't know, it's almost like a non-judgmental approach toward plants. It's like, okay, well, they're here, so, you know, what are we gonna you know, are we gonna just use a bunch of fossil fuel based mitigation strategies to completely eradicate them, or can we like learn to not only live with them but use them as tools? Like, so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, like, you know, specifically your approach to invasive species, but I think also it fits into this larger philosophical umbrella of like, all right, you know, use whatever tools are available. You know, this is the world we live in now. Like, we've got a, you know, a mix mash of like so many different, you know, times in which people have messed with ecosystems over many iterations. So, okay, you know, what are we going to do, and what's like the cost benefit moving forward of using different tools? And one of your principles in the book was to use biological resources. So I'm wondering, you know, just talking about that perspective in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, one of the things that I've noticed about invasive species and just, you know, the nature of dynamic ecosystems is that everything is doing something, you know? And so if we can kind of like understand what that is, whether it's, you know, nitrogen fixation or ground cover, or, you know, providing for pollinator resources, you know, habitat, things like that, kind of taking that like a beginner's mind approach, like, oh, I'm noticing that this is happening outside, and not like attaching a name or being like, oh, I saw this on the invasive plant list, but seeing what it's up to ecologically, I think is an important, you know, first step. And you may decide that you don't want it there, and that's fine too, but you know, the management of it should be based in that understanding of its biological and ecological nature. So, you know, thinking about something like English ivy, or here we have both that and Himalayan blackberry are ones that people are often, you know, kind of freaked out about it's like those are great fodder crops. I mean, you know, and I would rather animals be eating that than be eating, you know, alfalfa that's grown in Eastern Oregon where they've drained, you know, what used to be called the Everglades of the West, the Klamath Basin, to grow. You know, we've kind of like partitioned the ecological destruction, you know, in different areas and called it good because it's agriculture. But I feel like we need to kind of like really be looking closely and scrutinizing that, and also seeing some of these species that show up as a symptom maybe of some of that destruction as resources, you know, as we change the ecosystem towards something we rather have it look like if we want native plants, then we have to act like we want native plants. And most of the time we don't act like that in the way that we manage land, you know. We act like we want money. And so what we get is a highly changed ecosystem based on the fact that we just took, you know, all the trees down or removed the mountaintop or, you know, plowed all of the wetlands. There's going to be, you know, responses from that ecologically, and invasive species are often that. So.
You said that you lived in New Mexico for a while, right? Which is interesting because I lived in for a number of years, and I've lived in New Mexico for many years.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's an interesting connection. Curious what your reflections are on, since you've been in two very different kind of climactic ecological zones, if that's given you any kind of you know, parallax kind of perspective on, you know, on what we're talking about, and in general, I'm curious about, you know, your feelings about New Mexico and what you thought about it.
Oh my gosh, I love New Mexico. It's like, my family actually moved there when I was 10, and you know, we kind of lived there on and off, and then I moved back as an adult also, and just definitely has a big place in my heart.
That's funny. My mom, so I was in New Mexico. My mom moved to Oregon when I was 13. I followed her. Then I moved back to Oregon again for a weeks as an adult. So just kind of like the opposite.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of a place that gets into your system in a way that I've never been to really other places like that. It's like, I don't want to go back there. Yeah, I mean, living and farming in the high desert like that, and you know, two of the farms that I worked on there were on the irrigation ditch, you know, the acequia system, and you know, really seeing that. You know, one of them that I was on was way up in the Sangre de Cristo mountains, and the acequia had been built in 1540 by the Spanish. You know, before it was even part of the United States. But seeing the attention and intention of that, and really thinking about, you know, how that made different kinds of livelihood, agricultural, you know, in the European sense, possible, was really amazing, and definitely formative in my understanding of, you know, shaping landscapes and what people can do to, you know, bring life to land in different ways.
You also recommended the Milagro Beanfield War, which is one of my favorite books, and that happens to be a fight of, you know, small-scale Hispanic farmers losing their water rights to the big money gringos coming in. So it's very relevant to. I mean, that also, maybe this could lead into a new direction. You know, it speaks to kind of like the power dynamics, and you know, in many cases throughout history and even today, people's kind of right to a livelihood with the land is taken away from them. I'm wondering if you have, I don't know, thoughts about kind of legal regimes and how politics works I don't know if you want to go on any rants about that, or if you have any, I don't know, thoughts about that in general or in a specific case.
Well, I mean, I've just in this place, I've worked pretty closely with members of tribal communities here in Oregon, and I'm definitely familiar with the extent to which, essentially everything was taken, not very long ago. So,
Yeah.
1855 was kind of the major relocation of Indigenous folks in this area, and for me, really having the opportunity to sit with that as somebody who has benefited from being able to just kind of show up here and buy land, and has been really important and informative for me to just understand that, it's not, those stories are important, and thinking about that kind of access, who has the ability to do what I do, and what is the historical context for allowing that to happen, I think is a really important thing to understand. And it's sad, and it's heartrending, and it's hard to know how to move forward. At the same time, actually right after this podcast, I'm meeting with members of the Siletz tribal community, because I've been consulting with them on a property that they just bought that's a 38-acre farm. So I've tried to find ways that I can, be of service, and not in a kind of patronizing way, but in a way of like recognizing that that's one thing that I can do to kind of give back to some of the kind of unearned benefits that I've received as a person, that has benefited from dispossession and land theft in the United States, and we don't often talk about that as something that happens or has happened here, but it has, and that history is important and will continue to be something that's necessary, I think, for all people in this country and other countries. There's a lot of conversations happening in Canada right now. It's a very similar type of story. It's going to be a conversation that evolves over the next several decades, I imagine, about really, how can we make good on the historical wrongs that have happened, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's
important.
Yeah, totally. And for me, I think it's really important, to the point you made about not being patronizing. I think there's a lot of like lip service toward, historical inequity, but not a lot of action in positive directions. And I think, to me, at least from my perspective, like action should include like building relationship and trust, and not just sort of having this like a patronizing a view towards like, yes, you're so dispossessed, and I'm just going to say it out loud, and I guess that incantation is enough. Like, to me, it's a long process of like shifting the inequities in the other direction, and but in the context of a relationship and something healthy. I mean, I think, to me, a lot of the principles you talk about with regard to human interaction with ecosystems could also be applied human interaction, social interaction between groups, just sort of doing the least harm, and finding ways to move forward positively from here, being non-judgmental, this kind of thing. I wanted to just highlight a few of the permaculture principles you had in your book that really spoke to me, that I think could be relevant both for people with ecosystems, but also just people in their lives. Identify long-term goals. Amazing. maximize diversity. I think this could also apply to social situations. Use appropriate technology, like that applies to like the economy. For me, I'm a Luddite to the extent that don't go do any, you know, technology beyond the minimum viable one. Use biological resources. I would add to that, use social, cultural resources that exist. Be open to seeing the problem as the solution, or seeing a problem, you know, well, okay, this is a problem, but why do we see it as such, etc. Be wise with resource use, and place ourselves firmly within our ecosystems. So I don't know if you wanted to expand on like the philosophy of permaculture with regard to how to move forward positively.
And do you have any critiques of it, or would you suggest?
Sure, yeah. I mean, well, yeah, it's, you know, for me, when I kind of, well, I guess back up a little bit. I started, you know, my undergrad, my interest in agriculture, in organic agriculture. I was like super excited. You know, I studied it as a, you know, young college student, got hands-on training, but I was always kind of feeling like even in that context, there was something missing, which was like, well, if we're importing compost, where's that coming from? Oh, it's coming from Foster Farms chicken factories. But if you heat it up enough and turn it enough, it becomes organic, organically approved. It never kind of sat right with me. I was like, oh, what about the water? Where's that coming from? Oh, we have this huge pump and it just comes out of the aquifer like magic. I was always kind of interested in, you know, what lies beneath. And so when I found permaculture, I was like, oh, like here's a system that is kind of trying at least to understand all these different relationships and bring them in a little bit to, you know, your home, and not in the sense of being like, you know, the independent, self-sufficient person that doesn't need anything from the outside world. You know, I don't really believe that, you know, that was ever really possible, maybe in some isolated cases, but I think that, you know, there's also this piece of creating the network of a durable community of people who all, you know, their own families or, you know, households have tried to bring a lot of things closer, but at the same time recognize that we need each other too. And I think, you know, for me, I think permaculture design kind of offers a way of thinking through these principles that I think are fundamental to human nature. And it's not to say that permaculture is like the end all be all, but I think it does a really good job of putting that forward in a way that allows for a greater understanding of our ecosystem nature as people. Like, this is the way that we think. We are, you know, I think everybody has this in them. So for me, it's kind of more like a starting point, and it's a way to engage more deeply in kind of non-linear understandings of ourselves and nature, and, you know, the things that we do and the effects that they have. Yeah, just kind of putting that together, you know, in like a neat little system of 12 principles. And it's also, it has, you know, there's ethics there that have been identified. I think as it evolves, you know, there's been some critiques of like, oh, this has just been promoted by these two random white dudes from Australia, and that's definitely true, and that they, you know, took indigenous knowledge and just kind of said it was theirs, and I don't see that, you know, I'm open to that criticism, but I don't see that I do feel like they've done a pretty good job of saying this is actually based on traditional indigenous knowledge of agricultural and land management systems from all over the world. There's not a lot of like, oh, I made this up going on. So I appreciate that. Yeah, so, you know, there's been kind of like a back and forth. My husband and I have been like, should we say that, you know, permaculture we do? But, you know, for us right now, I think it's like a term that people recognize as kind of like a holistic design system. And, you know, when we do a design for people are looking at as much as we can, all of the different dynamics that are going on. And so it's nice to have a word that just says, yes, okay. You know,
I'm curious, what do you think?
Even though we can like debate it.
I was gonna say, I mean, so we also hear a lot about agroecology as a system, and it also seems to have a lot of similar principles, although it applies perhaps not as broadly. And like you can get a PhD in agroecology, but not in permaculture. And I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on the differences between those two systems, where they overlap? Or is it just a sociological difference, or have you found more substantial differences between those two?
I think there is a lot of overlap. You know, agroecology is, you know, kind of grew out of political movements in Latin America. And as a kind of response to colonization and corporate takeover of you know, indigenous land and livelihoods. And it's kind of like, it has a more of a political connotation, especially in those contexts. And it you know, I'm super grateful that it continues to grow and expand in terms of people finding ways to reclaim their agricultural food system sovereignty. And I think it does have a lot of parallels in its the way that it kind of played out on the land. It's very much about, you know, integrated biological land management and food production, particularly. And it can incorporate, you know, agroforestry and water harvesting and all these different things. I do consider it, just, you know, having studied it kind of in parallel. I actually wrote my master's thesis on agroecology and climate policy, but it does have a more like pointedly political element to it than permaculture does. Although, you know, there's like this saying that Bill Mollison, one of the kind of originators of like permaculture, you know, he wrote the Bible, the permaculture designer's manual. He said permaculture is a revolution disguised as organic gardening. I think, you know, for many people who are involved in it, they kind of think similarly. It's like, if we can kind of, you know, get some of these things set up for many, many people, it is kind of a way to detach from the bigger picture and build movement solidarity between, you know, all of these people who are a little less tapped into, you know, the corporate overtaking big that's happening right now.
Yeah.
I just, one more permaculture question, and then I think we could just move towards wrapping up. But I'm wondering, because Mark Shepard, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, kind of makes fun of permaculture, but to the extent that how it's used is like by a kind of a small subset of people who's somewhat focused on things like herb spirals and not like making a big substantive difference or a huge interaction with the land. They're kind of like, you know, this fringe or smaller scale group. I can understand that. I'm in general, I'm a pluralist, and I'm just like, they're fine, we're fine, everybody can work together, we can find our overlapping things. But I'm wondering if there's a way you see of like expanding the choir, the permaculture choir, You know, do you foresee that happening? I know that you're going to be a guest speaker in my homestead incubator class. I think there's a lot of people who are like interested in getting onto some land, and I would love to help bring a permaculture perspective to the people who are newly interested in land stewardship. That's my little contribution to that, but I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about that, if you agree with Mark or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Mark is amazing. I've been to his farm. It's amazing, and totally recommend checking out his work. And I think, you know, one of the things that I think maybe it had happened with permaculture, and I think this was maybe intentional on behalf of Mollison and Holmgren, you know, David Holmgren, who is still alive and still has an amazing site. Their tactic was a little bit less about production agriculture. And I think Shepard's analysis is that, you know, we should also be focusing on how to make this economically viable, and not just kind of the herb spiral. You know, full disclosure, I do not have an herb spiral. I generally don't recommend them. They're really hard to manage. However, if I had just like a tiny postage stamp of a lot, I might consider. It's not something that, you know, is like a thing. It's like a conceptual idea, you know, like how do you save space? Like go vertical if, you know, that makes sense. So yeah, I think that there's definitely room for permaculture type concepts to expand into business and, you know, the existing paradigm that people have to be a part of. And I think that that is kind of it has been kind of a weakness in the permaculture world, because so many people, you know, take permaculture courses and they want to get on land. And, you know, it's hard to kind of marry that with the current economic framework that, at least, you know, in North America, we're faced with. You know, you have to make a lot of money to make it work here, and it's challenging. And Mark Shepard's done a good job of, you know, taking a farm that was like, you know, degraded by years of corn and soy and turning it into a viable business. And I think that, you know, the thing for me about permaculture is that it's kind of like an umbrella, and there's like lots of different ways that it can iterate out on land. And, you know, one of the things is like, oh, does it make sense on your 90-acre farm in Wisconsin to create like an agroforestry type system and harvest all your water and have a cidery and, you know, 6 acres of asparagus? It's like, yeah, that's totally appropriate. It's a great design, his farm. And so I think having more people that have kind of a background in production agriculture having that permaculture analysis would be really helpful. So
yeah, and to me, my whole project is to get normal people into some kind of self-production and taking a permaculture or regenerative approach to that kind of thing. I think is like, you know, we need both the commercial farmers to think regeneratively, and we need small scale producers to just increase in general. Jason, do you have any final thoughts? And I just have a little section of a Wendell Berry poem from her book that I want to read at the end as we get towards the end.
Well, before we get to the Wendell Berry poem, I just want to, and before we give you the last words, but if you have any more thoughts, do you have any more thoughts of what you wish we had asked you, or what you would like to, you know, not leave the conversation with, you know, something you'd like our audience to leave with, I guess?
Great question.
Well, I saw on Twitter that somebody asked about whether I plant invasive species. Mm-hmm. And In general, no, I don't. I feel like there's plenty to work with without actively planting them. However, I do plant species that are, considered by some mildly invasive. I plant like here, autumn olive is that I use a lot in forest gardens. Things. It's not considered an invasive species in Oregon, but it is considered an invasive species in Illinois and Indiana, Michigan, I think maybe. In a context like that, and I've seen them in Illinois where they're just like, thickets. And in that context, I wouldn't be planting them, but I would be managing them similarly to how I manage them here. I find to be an incredible resource for nitrogen fixation. Very nice soft branch, and I can just cut them back and mulch them or feed it to my sheep. And they just really boost the production of foods that they're planted by. So I use them a lot. Yeah, I think, I wouldn't suggest planting like Japanese knotweed. I wouldn't plant, but I advocate for working with them, and there's ways to engage with whatever it is that you're finding in your landscape, and turn it into something more generative and biodiverse. So.
All right, Tao, you're breaking up a little bit towards the end here, so I'm just going to read this little section of this book, of this poem. It's called Work Song, A Vision. And then after I read this little section, I'll just let you have the last word. But I think here Barry's talking about this perspective of more or less how do we get out of this, and I think he's making the argument that we do it through work, through interaction with the land, but the work we do on the land. He says at the end here, memory native to this valley will spread over it like a grove, and memory will grow into legend, legend into song, song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds, will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream. It is its hardship is its possibility. That is like, oh, I get chills. So anyways, you have that at the beginning of your book. I'm wondering if you have a last word and why you included that.
Sure. I mean, I've just been, a big Wendell Berry fan for many years. That I just love that idea that people can be in community, re-engaging with land, and finding our place in it together, and kind of restoring what has been lost and creating something new and meaningful for ourselves and the next generations.